Successfully giving birth to a child can go down as one of the most satisfying experiences of a woman's life. On the other side of the coin, recovering from childbirth likely goes down as one of the most difficult. 4 experts in the field asked the question of what mattered the most to women in the post-childbirth period. They found that what mattered most to women was a positive postnatal experience where they were able to adapt to their new self-identity and develop a sense of confidence and competence as a mother, adjust to changes in their intimate and family relationships, including their relationship to their baby, navigate ordinary physical and emotional challenges, and experience the dynamic achievement of personal growth as they adjust to the new normal of motherhood and parenting in their own cultural contexts. Some countries excel at this, with Estonia leading the way by providing 84 weeks of the full employment rate equivalent so that the new mother can settle in with her child for 18 full months. Meanwhile, my own nation rates as the only OECD country without a national statutory paid maternity, paternity, or parental leave. Although many jobs will offer up to 12 weeks or just 3 months of unpaid maternity leave, only about 1 in 4 U.S. workers qualify. This is disheartening, as Time magazine points out that recent studies demonstrate a link between paid parental leave and a lower likelihood of postpartum depression, lower psychological distress, and better mood among mothers. Paid maternity leave is also linked with a higher quality of mother-child interactions and beneficial impact on infant attachment. It's no wonder most nations offer paid parental leave. In 1135, Matilda was unable to enjoy any of these benefits. As she lay in the depths of a difficult pregnancy, her father, King Henry, passed away from illness. Her cousin, Stephen of Blois, seized the opportunity, immediately heading towards London. The king had died late in the evening of December 1st. Stephen landed in Dover on December 5th and arrived in the capital on December 8th. He won over the people of London by utilizing a carrot-and-stick approach, pointing out that his land holdings controlled all of the city's critical trade routes, while simultaneously reassuring them that if he were accepted as the new monarch, London would be treated more as an autonomous commune rather than under the firm hand of a resident monarch. From London, Stephen rode straight away to secure the royal treasury of Winchester, the holdings of his younger brother Henry, who was the ruling bishop. The bishop utilized his connections to enlist the support of the Bishop of Salisbury, convincing the chamberlain to hand over the vault keys. Next, they appeared before the archbishop, the only man with the authority to officially crown the next ruler. This proved to be the first stumbling block, as the archbishop finally brought up the fact that Stephen had taken an oath to support Matilda as the heir. The usurpers produced a surprise witness who claimed that the king had renounced his support for his daughter at the very last moment of his life. Interestingly, the Bishop of Salisbury confirmed that the witness's claim was truthful, despite not being anywhere near the king's bedchambers in Normandy at the time. The sworn testimony of a bishop, however, was enough for the church. Historian Catherine Hanley, our main source for this series, tells us that Stephen was charming, Bishop Henry was persuasive and influential, and Bishop Roger held out the possibility of peace and continuity, having ruled England in King Henry's absence for the best part of the last 2 years, and being willing to continue to serve under Stephen. It was all enough for Archbishop William. A hastily arranged, simple, and sparsely attended coronation ceremony took place at Westminster Abbey on December 22, 1135, at which Stephen was crowned and anointed King of England. This consecration was irrevocable. By the time Stephen acted as one of the pallbearers at Henry's delayed funeral a week later, when the body had finally arrived at Reading, he was indisputably a king. Matilda was 12 weeks into her third pregnancy and in no condition to brave the rough seas that accompanied a channel crossing during the winter. Her current state was just one reason why she appeared to hesitate in the face of her cousin's bold actions. She likely believed that Stephen was an outlier, and that the majority of the barons and clergy who had pledged to support her would eventually come around and rectify the situation for her. When she did eventually move, she headed from her own province of Anjou to Normandy, the birthplace of the Normans, where the local rulers honored their pledge by handing over 3 castles in Argentan. Meanwhile, her husband Geoffrey traveled to the northwest to secure more castles in Maine, giving Matilda a foothold that she would never lose. Unprepared to rush headlong into the political fray, she initially bided her time. Hanley points out that the frustrating irony now was that Matilda had done everything that her father wished, only to find out it all worked against her when it mattered because she was located both physically and politically at the outer edge of the Anglo-Norman world. Her initial maneuvers, however, suggest that Matilda wasn't willing to take Stephen's insult lying down. It turns out she was more than willing to fight for the crown that was lawfully hers. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon Matilda of England. Episode number 4, Matilda the Warrior. Stephen of Blois would have been regarded as the least probable individual to betray Matilda. He had narrowly avoided the fate of the rest of the court in the White Ship disaster by getting off the ship at the last moment due to a queasy stomach. He had been a loyal follower of Henry's court, and his marriage to another English Matilda added Boulogne to his land holdings, making him one of the wealthiest lords in the land. Historian Elizabeth Norton writes that Stephen may have been the last person Matilda suspected of betraying her. Stephen appears to have been an affable man, with one chronicler praising him as rich and at the same time unassuming, generous, courteous. Moreover, in all the conflicts of war or in any siege of his enemies, bold and brave, judicious and patient. Unfortunately, we don't have a clear-cut justification for why Stephen took the actions that he did. Certainly, a large number of nobles accepted him as their liege out of fear of being controlled by England's first ruling female. However, we don't know if Stephen felt that way. After all, he was the first noble to have made the pledge to support her, and reaffirmed his oath of allegiance at least one time afterwards. Certainly, his seizure of the crown could have just been an instance of naked ambition. We know for a fact that his younger brother was obsessed with the accumulation of power. It stands to reason that his sibling was likewise ambitious. A number of individuals who have survived close calls with death go on to do great things. Their heads become filled with the notion that they were saved for some higher purpose. Still, there aren't copies of speeches which suggest that he had some sort of god complex. Likely, Stephen's seizure of the crown was merely an impulse. Throughout Stephen's rule, he lacked foresight, rushing headlong into conflict without thinking about the long game. His ability to adeptly respond to the unexpected proved quite valuable, as he swiftly altered his course in order to confront an invasion from the north led by Scotland's King David. He mustered such a formidable army that David, intent on honoring his oath of allegiance to Matilda, relented. signing a peace treaty that preserved his territorial holdings. However, this initial act of leniency towards an adversary who had raised a foreign host against him would ultimately contribute to Stephen's downfall. He demonstrated excessive kindness towards his enemies, a trait ill-suited for a medieval kingdom's ruler. Nevertheless, he maintained control over the island of Britain, wore the crown, and held the keys to the treasury. With each passing day that Matilda remained on the other side of the channel, her position weakened in comparison. She benefited from an inefficient beginning to King Stephen's rule. History writer Jessica Bain teaches us that Stephen soon took the necessary steps to consolidate his rule. However, with threats to his new regime looming and Matilda's claim to the throne remaining ever present, Stephen's time as monarch ushered in a wave of social unrest, political fragmentation, and the breakdown of law and order, which became known as the Anarchy. While Stephen served as reigning monarch, his personality was noticeably different to that of his predecessor. Recorded as having a rather affable personality, his inability to make tough decisions inevitably led to chaos during his reign, as the nobility were able to exploit his work leadership for their own gain. During this period, the robber barons became greedy, building unlicensed castles and ruling their local populace with an iron fist. Baldwin de Redvers was the first to openly rebel, forcing King Stephen to appear in person, demanding that Baldwin's garrison surrender to his royal authority. The Deeds of Stephen, an account written anonymously in real time, claims that the newly crowned king rose to the occasion. Day and night he vigorously and energetically pressed on with the siege of the garrison. Sometimes he joined battle with them by means of armed men crawling up the rampart. Sometimes, by the aid of countless slingers who had been hired from a distant region, he assailed them with unendurable hail of stones. At other times, he summoned those who had skill in mining underground and ordered them to search into the bowels of the earth with a view of demolishing the wall. Frequently, too, he devised engines of different sorts to shake or undermine the wall. Despite all of this, Baldwin held out for 3 months, only surrendering once the garrison had run out of food, and perhaps more importantly for the men's morale, wine. But defeat was snatched from the jaws of victory, as Stephen had exhausted a significant portion of his treasury, and rather than providing a harsh deterrent to others who were plotting their own rebellion, Stephen dealt with the traitorous garrison honorably, allowing them to leave in peace. Even Baldwin somehow survived the encounter unscathed, departing the island nation to join Matilda's court in order to become one of her firmest supporters. Matilda gave birth to her third son in July of 1136, naming the boy William after his great-grandfather. While William had likely been considered for the boy's name from the moment of conception, a given as she had already used the names of her father and her husband, its selection showcased her mindset at the moment as she was contemplating a cross-channel invasion to claim her rightful throne of England. The last time such an event occurred had been in 1066. She was forced into taking a long view, however. As Hanley explains, she controlled no port in Normandy, had no safe route to the coast. To attempt an invasion of England at this point without proper backup and against Stephen's wealth of resource would be absolute folly. The most likely outcome of that potential course of action would be her capture and possible lifelong incarceration, as had been the case for her uncle, Robert Cutthros, and the consequent loss of opportunity for her sons, who would be forced into a Clito-esque life of exile. The remainder of 1136 saw them making little military progress in Normandy. However, they were able to regroup after Louis VII succeeded his father on the French throne. Known for his monkish tendencies, Louis goes down in history as one of the world's worst military leaders. Stephen continued to crisscross his country, putting out the small fires of rebellion. But danger loomed in December of 1137, when David, the King of the Scots, once again sauntered his military down from the north. This time, his forces were ready to go on the offensive, with the deeds of Stephen informing us that the Scots were barbarous and filthy, neither overcome by excess of cold nor enfeebled by severe hunger, putting their trust in swiftness of foot and light equipment. Among foreigners, they surpass all in cruelty. Stephen marched at the head of a large army to turn back the threat in January of 1138. We aren't sure about the details, but something happened around this time to cause Robert of Gloucester to turn on King Stephen. In addition to Robert being among the richest of English noblemen, he was also the half-brother of Matilda, and most importantly, the holder of a large portion of coastal Normandy. Whatever the reason for his switch, Robert would prove to be the single most important member of Matilda's loyalists. As part of his defection, he publicly denounced Stephen's actions, accusing him of breaking sacred oaths and asserting unequivocally that Matilda should be Queen of England. Hanley informs us that the alliance gave her access and safe passage to the sea. Matilda and Joffrey wasted no time. By June 1138, they were moving through Normandy with an army at their back, picking off a number of Stephen's smaller castles in the duchy as they went. She wintered for 1138 on his lands, plotting their crossing while Stephen was distracted by the threat from Scotland. Rather than launching a full-scale invasion, she opted for a strategic approach, leaving her husband Joffrey to continue his campaign in Normandy. This decision served to protect her rear, maintain the unity of the kingdom, and assert her own authority as the prospective queen ruler, rather than merely the spouse of a king. In September of 1139, she sailed across the Channel to the lands of her stepmother, Adeliza, along the Sussex coast. Despite Adeliza's public support for Stephen as king, she welcomed Matilda's visit, hosting her along with 140 knights and 3,000 infantry. Meanwhile, Robert detached himself to covertly head to his English landholdings to prepare them for the impending rebellion. Stephen must have felt like Hercules battling the Hydra at this junction of his rule. For every rebellion he quelled, two more seemed to spring up in its place. However, it was only the arrival of Matilda, the woman whose throne he had usurped, which posed a genuine threat to his rule. Hanley provides the context for us, writing that this was the most serious crisis of Stephen's reign to date. He had been putting down rebellions for several years, but they had been sporadic, uncoordinated. Now that Matilda, his rival for the throne, was actually on English soil with an experienced commander at her side, his hold on the crown was markedly less secure. He immediately headed for the Queen Dowager's lands in Arundel, and arrived within a week of Matilda's landfall. While her stepmother's castle was defensible, Matilda lacked the manpower to withstand a prolonged conflict with Stephen. Meanwhile, the king himself couldn't afford a protracted siege, resembling the tale of the boy in the dike who saved a village by plugging a leak with his finger. However, Stephen was akin to the boy running out of fingers to hold back the water that was steadily threatening to breach the barrier. It was chivalry that saved Matilda. First, her stepmother claimed that Matilda was merely there for a visit, and there was nothing illegal about visiting family. Secondly, the Queen Dowager still held an esteemed position within the English hierarchy, and it would have been dishonorable to attack her unprovoked. Finally, Stephen himself was too chivalric for his own good. In the negotiations that ensued, the king generously allowed Matilda to safely exit Arundel in order to travel to her half-brother's lands in Gloucester. Hanley tells us that on a superficial level, this appears to have been a huge error of judgment by Stephen, and indeed some chroniclers interpreted it this way. His rival for the throne was trapped at the very edge of England and could be easily surrounded. She could have no communication with the outside world and was at his mercy. But he let her go. It was in his power at this time to have easily stifled a flame which threatened great mischief. If, within a policy becoming the wise, he had at once crushed the deadly efforts of those whose enterprise threatened the country with pillage, slaughter, and depopulation. The historian makes the case against this, however, claiming that it may have been in the king's best interest to shift Matilda to the west, as it would physically separate her from reinforcements via her husband Geoffrey in Normandy. It's not unreasonable to assume that Stephen may have underestimated Matilda's capabilities due to her gender, believing that the true threat lay in the military might of her husband rather than her ability to rally the country to her cause. Hanley writes that Matilda's sex had finally done her a favor, as a king ruled only with the support of his barons. So if Stephen were to act harshly, he ran the risk of alienating those who had a conscience. One of the two escorts provided by Stephen for the journey to the west was his brother, Bishop Henry of Winchester. Bishop Henry was exceptionally ambitious and had already begun to fall out with his brother, as he had expected to be mightily rewarded for the role that he had played in securing his brother's crown. In 1136, he presented himself as a candidate for the vacant position of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who served as the de facto head of the English Church. The seat was left vacant through 1138, and when it was finally filled, it wasn't Henry's name that Stephen put forth. Hanley writes that Bishop Henry's allegiance to his brother came a distant third in his priorities behind his loyalty to the church and his own personal ambition, not necessarily in that order, suggesting that he may have been eager to betray his brother. It was upon Henry's advice that Stephen had allowed Matilda to escape. True to the king's word, Matilda arrived safely in Bristol and promptly established a rival court. The halls quickly filled as she began accepting pledges of allegiance from visiting lords sympathetic to her cause or disillusioned with King Stephen's rule. Notably, Miles of Gloucester and Brian Fitzcount aligned with her. Miles brought elite military expertise, while Brian lent political credibility to her claims. Stephen now had justification to act against Matilda, as it was illegal to establish oneself as a regent. He lay siege to Brian Fitzcount's castle at Wallingford, seeking to capture it and use it as the staging ground for his invasion of Matilda's half-brother's territory. Miles' men slipped past Stephen's, however, and attacked the king's army from behind, pinning them against the city's walls. With the maneuver, the route now lay open to the capital for the combined forces of Matilda's new lieutenants. Having only been there for a month, she had managed to establish a secure base for her campaign and had begun to advance not as a rebel, but as a monarch. For the remainder of 1139, the two factions traded blows, exchanged counsels, and flipped allies to their sides. The chronicler William of Malmesbury writes that the whole year of 1140 was troubled by the brutalities of war. There were many castles all over England, each defending its own district, or, to be more truthful, plundering it. Handley writes of the year that Matilda's domain was consolidated and gradually expanded by her lieutenants. Yet her party was not strong enough for an all-out attack and needed to continue with guerrilla tactics. Despite this need for additional soldiers, Matilda refused to summon her husband from his own fighting in Normandy, which continued at a slow and steady pace. Although there was an attempt to negotiate in 1140, neither side was willing to cede to the other the crown of England, and thus the Civil War persisted into 1141. The first half of that year was one of triumph for Matilda's forces. Earl Ranulph, who had remained stubbornly undeclared, paid a Christmas-time visit to friends in Lincoln Castle. He brought with him his wife, yet another noble woman bequeathed with the name Matilda. She also happened to be the daughter of Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's half-brother. Rather than exchanging Christmas-time gifts, Ranulph seized the castle right out from under the nose of King Stephen. When the king arrived at the head of a besieging force, Ranulph slipped out the back door, traveling to Robert in order to inform him that his forces held the castle for Matilda, but it was besieged. He made sure to mention that Robert's daughter was among those trapped in Lincoln and in desperate need of rescue. Matilda's men immediately traveled to relieve the siege. Handley writes that Stephen, inside the city's walls, now found himself in one of the worst possible positions, militarily speaking, trapped between his enemies inside the castle and an approaching army that had arrived much faster than anticipated and running the risk of being crushed between them. He took advice that he should make a strategic withdrawal rather than fight, but he spurned their advice and decided to fight anyway. The primary reason for this was personal to Stephen, an episode from his family history that continued to haunt him. In 1098, his father had made just such a strategic withdrawal from Antioch under very similar circumstances, deeming the position hopeless. But those left behind had won a great and improbable victory, and his father had been lambasted across Europe for cowardice, a reputation he never lived down. To withdraw in the face of battle might result in the label, like father, like son, for the rest of his life. Matilda's army, comprising a diverse mix of forces that had never trained or fought together, emerged victorious. Despite witnessing his army disintegrate around him, Stephen bravely continued to fight on, refusing to abandon the field. Chronicler Henry of Huntington writes that no pause or respite was given to them, except in the area where the mighty king was standing, his enemies trembling at the incomparable ferocity of the blows he struck. After breaking his sword, he continued to fight on with an old Norwegian battle axe. He was said to have held his ground like a lion, standing single-handed in the field until he was hit in the helmet with a rock, resulting in him being captured by William de Cahanzy, who shouted for all to hear that, "Here, everybody, here, I have the king." Matilda was fully in control of military strategy for most of the anarchy, but moments like the sacking of Lincoln Castle were fortunate moments of luck rather than the effect of well-laid plans. She was 140 miles from Lincoln at the moment of the king's capture, and the battle had begun with an unannounced sneak attack by a man who was not yet her follower. Indeed, the entire episode unfolded without her approval. Rather, it was her half-brother, who was seeking to rescue his daughter, that led to the fortunate result. 7 days after the battle, Robert of Gloucester showed up to Matilda's court with Stephen in his custody. While Matilda was far more ruthless than Stephen, he was a crowned king, and thus, according to the code of chivalry, entitled to some level of respect and decency. Rather than facing the executioner, he was sent to Robert's castle of Bristol to spend the remainder of his life imprisoned within the same dungeon that once held Matilda's uncle, Robert Curthroats. Matters worsened for Stephen after he was discovered bribing some of his captors. As a result, he was clamped in irons, dramatically hindering his mobility. From Lincoln, Matilda marched triumphantly towards Winchester, the site of the royal treasury, in February 1141. There, Bishop Henry, Stephen's brother, held significant sway. The two convened in person on March 2nd, and the ambitious Henry switched sides in the conflict, pledging his allegiance to Matilda under the condition that she would utilize him as an advisor. Several bishops aligned with Henry participated in a ceremonial procession through Winchester Cathedral, symbolizing the transition of power. However, one notable holdout remained, the Archbishop, who refused to switch allegiance without Stephen's authorization. Surprisingly, Matilda granted the Archbishop permission to visit the captive king. Even more surprisingly, Stephen, known for his friendliness, acquiesced to the request. This unexpected move resulted in the church uniting behind Matilda. Hanley writes that although it is difficult to infer exactly what was going on in Stephen's mind at the time, it is possible that defeated, captured, enchained, the prospect of lifelong imprisonment looming, and feeling that God had deserted him, he had already given up hope. With his boss's blessing, Henry assembled the local officials who had proven hesitant to switch their allegiance. To these individuals, he proclaimed Matilda as Lady of the English, and proceeded to use the powers of his office to excommunicate anyone who still opposed her. The next step in her journey would be to Westminster Abbey in London, where she would be officially crowned. Although one would think that this would have been a joyous occasion that you would want to share with your loved ones, Matilda didn't lift one finger in order to bring her husband Geoffrey and their 3 young boys across the channel. Her entire life had been spent being bossed around by men, and she was done serving as a placeholder for their interests. This time, her intention was to be crowned alone. She stayed in Winchester until May, meeting with and accepting new lords willing to once again pledge themselves to her cause. Stockpiling support was key, as she knew that London was likely to remain hostile to her claim. Stephen's wife had set up what remained of their faction in Kent, writing first to Matilda in the unlikely hope that she would be willing to release the king and restore him to his throne. Failing that, the sitting queen dramatically shifted her position and demeanor for her next approach. Norton suggests that Matilda could have handled the situation more diplomatically, writing that Stephen's wife came to Matilda personally and begged for the release of her husband in order that he could live quietly in retirement with her. Instead of heeding the woman's pleas, Matilda abused her in harsh and insulting language, causing Stephen's wife to take up arms on her husband's behalf. Rather than dealing with the Queen's rebels in Kent, she chose to concentrate on problems that were more immediate. The path to the capital had finally opened after her agents had successfully bought off Geoffrey de Mandeville, the ruler of the London Tower. Built by William the Conqueror, the tower remained a state-of-the-art castle. Had Mandeville remained in place, Matilda would have been forced into a protracted siege within the confines of a city that was hostile towards her. For the relatively small forces serving beneath Matilda's banners, it was a non-starter. In mid-June, however, the Tower's resident Joffrey came to her side in exchange for carte blanche protection from the law while on his own lands. He was just one of the problems that were suddenly thrust upon her. Control of the Tower didn't confer London to her side, and Joffrey wasn't the only dissatisfied noble in the city. Fortunately, she had the ability to redistribute the lands and titles which she had stripped from her enemies. Bishop Henry attempted to advise Matilda to confer Stephen's extensive land holdings to his son Eustace. This was, of course, rejected, as it would take away her largest carrot as well as set up the 11-year-old boy as a rallying point for anybody who chose to remain loyal to the imprisoned Stephen. The bishop saw this rejection of his advice as a sign that he had made a horrific mistake in betraying his brother. Handley informs us that part of the reason that Henry had switched his allegiance was that he was dissatisfied with Stephen. Stephen had refused to be ruled by him. Now it was clear that Matilda was set upon the same course, relegating the ambitious bishop to the sideline. He responded as though he were a petulant child, abandoning the Empress's side in order to quickly return to Winchester. She had to deal with the citizens of London before she could call her childish bishop to task. The capital had enjoyed the rule of Stephen, who had rarely resided within the city during his short reign. London was large enough to house multiple chroniclers, most of whom proved to be quite biased against Matilda's gender. For the past few years, they had worked overtime to ensure that their readers were fully against her as she entered the city for her coronation. From the onset, she faced hostile crowds, and her first impression didn't make the situation any better for her. Rather than forgiving the city for supporting her enemy and lavishing gifts as though it were a Roman triumph, she announced her arrival by demanding taxes in order to offset the costs of the war against Stephen. Rather than just kicking them while they were down, she appeared to bend over and rob them as well. The Deeds of Stephen notes that after the city's representatives claimed to be financially ruined because of the war, she, with a grim look, her forehead wrinkled into a frown, every trace of a man's gentleness removed from her face, blazed into unbearable fury. Still, problems aside, she sat down for dinner on June 24th, 1141, believing that the following day she was to officially enter the city for her coronation. She had no idea that another Queen Matilda, Stephen's wife, was marching at the head of an army directly towards her precarious position. In the midst of her dinner, bells rang throughout the city, a preconceived signal for the Londoners to rise up in opposition to Matilda, whom they viewed as the usurper. The attack was so sudden that Matilda and her entourage barely escaped from their apartments. Chroniclers at the time reported that the group's food was still warm when the mob broke into her chambers. This was the closest that Matilda would come to being crowned as the ruler of England. Her allies had scattered in the face of the Queen's sudden arrival. Joffrey reneged on his deal and took back control of the Tower of London in the name of King Stephen. And Bishop Henry officially flipped back to his brother's side, taking with him control of the royal treasury. In the course of one day, she had lost her army, her castle, and her treasury. Still, she held Stephen in her custody, the ultimate trump card during the war. She also had yet to summon her ace in the hole, her husband Joffrey, who was continuing his successful military campaign in Normandy. Seeking to regain momentum, she turned what remained of her forces towards Winchester in order to rescue the royal treasury. It would prove harder this second time around. As we've hinted at, Bishop Henry was not a normal man of the cloth. For example, rather than aiding the poor and the wretched, he utilized church funds to build his own grand castle. Thus, the city of Winchester had two competing castles within the city limits. Matilda arrived at the royal castle, which remained loyal to her on July 31st. She immediately demanded an audience with the turncoat bishop, who took the summons as though it were an arrest warrant and subsequently fled towards the army of Londoners that were following in the wake of Matilda's retreat from the city. Believing that the threat was far enough away, she besieged Henry's grand castle of Wolvesey on August 1st. Unlike the prior battles, Matilda was on the scene for this one, able to direct some of the strategy rather than just reading about what had happened after it was all done. Hanley writes that the garrison, acting under instructions left by Bishop Henry, caused both a destruction and a potential disaster by throwing out from the castle burning material that, in the summer heat, quickly set the city ablaze. John of Worcester says of the bishop that, goaded by rage and to strike terror and dismay into the hearts of the people, he determined to set fire to the city and burn it to the ground. This seems a strange and potentially desperate thing for Henry to do. While burning and wasting were acknowledged features of warfare, this was his own city, his own flock, who might, under more normal circumstances, look to him for protection. The great stone cathedral survived, but much of the town, wooden houses with thatched roofs, was lost. The devastation meant that Matilda's forces were deprived of shelter and provisions, to say nothing of the fate of the unfortunate citizens who lost their homes and livelihoods. But worse was to come, when an army led by Queen Matilda and William of Pries, no doubt with Bishop Henry in tow, arrived. Matilda ought to have immediately abandoned her position in Winchester. But just like Stephen had mistakenly done in Lincoln, she attempted to make a heroic stand. Hanley writes that every day that Matilda's army remained in Winchester, the stocks of supplies grew smaller, and with no coherent plan for or realistic chance of taking Wolsey Castle, they were reduced to skirmishes in the streets, which did little except cost them casualties. After a month of steady losses and declining supplies, the situation finally became untenable. Matilda and her army were faced with stark choices: starve, surrender, or try to break out. They decided on the third option, and the withdrawal was planned for Sunday, September 14th. But by then, it was far too late. Matilda's forces were harried throughout the retreat. Placing Matilda in a position of safety in the vanguard, it rushed across England, trying to desperately stay one step ahead of their enemy. It was so frantic that at least one chronicler used gendered language to explain that Matilda was forced to ride like a man. She was utterly exhausted by the time she finally reached the safety of her half-brother's lands of Gloucester. After being one sleep away from the ultimate prize, she was back to where she began, no closer to the crown. The setback wasn't lost upon Matilda, with one chronicler referred to her as nearly half dead upon their arrival home. Devastatingly, her half-brother Robert didn't arrive, having been captured by the enemy forces during the harrowing retreat. Hanley puts it all in perspective for us by noting that the royal treasury was gone, the support of the church was gone, her army was broken and dispersed, and she had lost the one person she could not manage without. The decision to retreat from Winchester should have been taken earlier, before the situation became so desperate. After all, who was going to rescue them, with every one of Matilda's greatest supporters there already? But it was not. It seemed likely that this was due to Matilda herself, that she saw everything she had gained slipping away from her, and so she held on and remained in place far longer than was prudent, stubbornly refusing to accept the reality of the situation. The decision to stay until the last possible moment is certainly more suggestive of the determined and desperate Matilda than the cautious and experienced Robert. Matilda was known for steely determination, but in this moment she lacked the ruthlessness of her father. She exchanged King Stephen for her half-brother, believing that she might be able to keep Stephen away from the throne, but she would get no closer to it herself without Robert. Now she truly had been sent back to the starting line. The Civil War would continue prolonging the suffering of the people of England. Matilda turned 40 in 1142 and finally accepted the humiliation of asking her husband to lend her troops to break the stalemate. However, Geoffrey delayed, purely focused on his own war in Normandy. Though it had been phrased as a request, it had truly been a demand. Seeking to rectify the situation, Matilda dispatched her newly freed half-brother Robert to persuade her husband to send the reinforcements. It was here that Geoffrey proved himself to be just as clever as he was handsome. He convinced Robert that the fastest way to help Matilda would be for him to win the war for Normandy. Thus, Robert of Gloucester entered the fray of a second war. He repeatedly displayed his valor, capturing at least 10 castles for Geoffrey. While Robert was away, Stephen made a dramatic feint and surprised Matilda while she was in Oxford. Hanley writes that Stephen had let Matilda go from Arundel. She had escaped the mob at Westminster and the Queen's forces at Winchester. This time he would not give up, not until she was captured and safely under lock and key. Stephen established his siege with such determined resolution that he declared no hope of advantage or fear of loss should induce him to depart until the castle was delivered up and the Empress surrendered to his power. The siege had been in place for 3 months when Matilda made one of the most daring escapes in history. On a cold December day that was blanketed with snow, Matilda, clothed in all white garments, slipped out of the back gate with just 3 or 4 similarly dressed retainers. From there, they snuck out to the river Thames, which was frozen over. Risking the ice breaking beneath them, they slowly crossed the river. She wasn't done yet, however, as the small group had to next walk directly through the besieging army's camp. Having successfully done that, the Empress and her small guard then continued on foot through deep snow for 6 long, terrifying miles in order to purchase horses and continue on to a new safehold. That story is so good that it doesn't need embellishment. That came later, with the author of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claiming that she was lowered from the tall tower during the night by ropes in order to avoid being seen. Another, later tale confused the facts and claimed that she was lowered via ropes as if she were dead, lying on a platform wrapped in white as though she were a mummy awaiting burial. Incredibly, no one sought out the body, and once day turned to night, she arose and snuck out alone past Stephen's men, who were said to be drunkenly celebrating her death. Matilda's heroic escape was a political disaster for Stephen, who soon became aware that her capable half-brother Robert had returned from Normandy. Although Geoffrey had refused to send any men with him, Robert did have in tow Matilda's 9-year-old son, Henry. The boy's arrival began the slow process of transitioning the goal of placing the crown on her own head to that of bestowing it upon her sons. Recognizing the stalemate, the two sides ceased trying to unseat Stephen and began to fight over who would succeed him. Henry's arrival seemed to invigorate his mother, pushing the conflict to a standstill. Fed up with the continuation of this never-ending anarchy, individuals began to look out for themselves. For instance, Geoffrey of Mandeville ran afoul of Stephen, resulting in his expulsion from the Tower of London and the seizure of all of his family's lands. The offended lord responded by plundering the English countryside, forcing Stephen to momentarily turn his attention away from Matilda in the west. In 1146, nearly 4 years after Matilda's dramatic escape, the two sides met for peace negotiations. But again, neither side would relinquish the crown to the other. The next year, 14-year-old Henry decided to take matters into his own hands, believing, like all teenagers do, that only he held the answers. The boy gathered with a small band of mercenaries and set sail from his father's court in Normandy for southern England. Panic ensued as initial reports claimed that the boy had arrived with a massive host, likely presuming that this was Matilda's husband, finally summoning all of his forces for a William the Conqueror-like cross-strait invasion. When Stephen came to realize that the war party was just a boy and his friends, he quickly swatted them down. Henry appealed to his mother and uncle for relief, but neither mustered a single troop as this unplanned invasion threatened everything that they had spent the better part of a decade fighting for. Hanley reveals to us the Empress's thinking, stating that she had learned her lessons in the school of hard knocks. So should he. And she could gamble on the fact that the ever-merciful, to the point of folly Stephen, would not really hurt him. The best thing for Henry to do at this juncture was to get back across the channel as soon as possible, and Matilda evidently thought that denying him resources was the best way to achieve this. However, it turns out that Henry had not even planned that far ahead, and he was too broke to arrange his own passage home. So he took the obvious course of action. In an act of almost fantastical audacity, he asked Stephen for money. And true to form, Stephen obliged. I wish it weren't the case, but nice guys really do finish last in the history books. Stephen could have gained a trump card by capturing his enemy's firstborn son. Instead, the king paid for his safe travels home. It is possible that he was more worried about upsetting the boy's father than his mother. For as long as Joffrey stayed in Normandy, Matilda wouldn't have enough forces at her disposal to unseat him. In 1147, Duke Robert passed away. Recognizing that she no longer had a chance of winning via military means, Matilda returned to Normandy in 1148. Her retreat didn't signal an ending of the conflict, but rather a new chapter. She established herself in Rouen and laid eyes upon her husband for the first time in 9 years. 4 years earlier, Joffrey had completed his conquest of Normandy, and the couple thus securely held Anjou and Normandy as their main land base of operations. With his mother's blessing this time, Henry launched a new invasion in the spring of 1149. For the first time, he proclaimed himself the rightful ruler of England via the Lady Empress, his mother, and King Henry, his grandfather. In order to boost his credentials, he was knighted by David, the King of the Scots, who had remained a faithful ally of the Empress. His journey to the knighting ceremony in the land of the Scots was fraught with peril, as he escaped no less than 3 separate ambushes that had been set up by King Stephen's son. The prince didn't take his failure well, setting fire to houses and churches in each location where Henry had eluded him. Actions such as this made Eustace hated among the English citizens after the young man had decided to burn already harvested crops in order to ensure that his own people starved because of their inability to capture young Henry. Guerrilla raids throughout the English countryside continued throughout the year, but Henry returned to Normandy in 1150 as a battle-tested knight. His proud father stepped aside and proclaimed Henry Duke of Normandy. In their eldest son, they had found their talisman. Matilda introduced Henry to France's King Louis VII in order to procure an ally against Stephen. Henry, however, spent most of his time at court finding hidden locations in order to conduct an affair with the French king's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. In 1152, when Louis annulled his marriage to Eleanor, Henry was the one to rescue her from a number of bachelors who sought to capture her in order to obtain her extensive lands in southern France. One would-be kidnapper was Henry's own little brother Geoffrey. The two lovers quickly wed. The move, which coincided with Henry obtaining Marne through inheritance via his uncle, meant that Aquitaine was added to his land holdings, giving the family the entire western half of what we know as France today. As Henry was gaining in power, Eustace, Stephen's heir, was weakening. Hugely unpopular with the people, Stephen attempted to have the boy crowned while he was still living. This would allow him to help guide the boy during what was sure to be a tumultuous first couple of years on the throne. But the Pope intervened, refusing to allow Stephen to step down and name a successor as the matter of the crown was in dispute. The best that he could do was to let his lords know that it was his wish for his son to succeed him and hope that they stayed true to their word, even though he himself hadn't when the last king had passed. Duke Henry again crossed the Channel in 1153, this time at the head of a sizable force of 140 knights and 3,000 infantrymen. Matilda, after her husband had passed away, now ruled Henry's French lands in absentia. Hanley reveals to us that after all the years of war and devastation, there was to be no great final battle, but rather a series of smaller events which, as they built up, meant that everyone agreed that enough was finally enough. Tired of the endless warfare, Stephen and Henry negotiated a settlement, which would allow Stephen, now a man in his 60s, to finish out his rule in peace. Henry would be named his heir to follow. Eustace, his son and previous heir, would inherit Stephen's ancestral lands, but not the throne of England. The deal was acceptable to Stephen and Henry, but Eustace raged at the proclamation, laying waste to an abbey and its surrounding countryside. God evidently didn't like that reaction, and Eustace died of a seizure a few weeks later. Less than a year later, on October 25, 1154, Stephen fell ill and died, making Henry the King of England. This time, the people of Great Britain patiently waited until the designated heir came to claim his throne. The anarchy was at an end. Regrettably, Matilda was not present for her son's coronation. Knowing that it would be a distraction, she claimed that her duties as regent in Normandy were far too pressing for her to depart. She had once again been forced to put the interests of a male relative over her own. She had to have been pleased, however, to have heard that the crown that Henry had placed upon his head during the ceremony was one of the 2 crowns that she had brought back from Germany 3 decades earlier. From Normandy, she continued to provide advice to her son, managing to steer him away from a potentially disastrous war in Ireland. After an illness robbed her of some of her faculties in 1160, Henry began to ignore her advice, but allowed her to remain in charge of Normandy. She passed away in 1167 at the age of 65. Henry provided the official epitaph, proclaiming that she was great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring. Here lies the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry. Sadly, that description reduces her to less than her male relatives. That was precisely what she had resisted for her entire adult life. Gilbert Folliot, one of her loyal bishops, captured her legacy best in writing, that she crossed the sea, passed over mountains, penetrated into unknown regions, married there at her father's command, and remained there carrying out the duties of imperial rule virtuously and piously. And though she had attained such high rank that it is reported she had the title and status of Queen of the Romans, she was in no way puffed up with pride, but meekly submitted in all things to her father's will. In all this you will not find any cause why she should have been disinherited. England would not have a queen regent until Mary I in 1553, 400 years after Matilda had attempted to blaze a trail towards female empowerment. Hanley points out that medieval England had accepted the reign of several underage boys and at least one lunatic, to say nothing of various men who were alleged to have been murderers, rapists, or both, but never a woman. If Matilda had not doggedly pursued and fought for her rights, the subsequent royal line of England would have looked very different, with the throne passing to the ineffectual William of Blois, or indeed the erotic Eustache, who might not have died in 1153 had he not been disinherited, instead of the energetic Henry Fitz-Empress. There would have been no royal Plantagenet dynasty, no heroic Richard the Lionheart, nor the influential but incapable John. Every subsequent monarch of England and later Great Britain has been a direct descendant of Matilda. This includes both Elizabeths, two of the most beloved female rulers in human history. By serving as an advisor and regent of Normandy, she paved the path for women to be politically active, a role that her daughter-in-law, Eleanor of Aquitaine, picked up with boundless enthusiasm. Matilda had chosen to be the agent of her own destiny. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowry@gmail.com or find the show on the platform formerly known as Twitter. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.